everyone, welcome. My name is Jessalyn Keller. I'm a lecturer here at Middlesex. I'm going to be chairing this panel titled Resistant Identities, Practices, and Platforms, Exploring Activist Media Production. So we can be pretty casual. I don't want the day to be too formal. But what we'll do basically is I'll introduce each speaker. They'll give their paper, approximately 12 to 15 minutes or so. And then we'll hold off and do Q&A all at the end. We can get the speakers up here and hopefully have a bit of a discussion. We are running 15 minutes behind schedule, just due to kind of people coming in and stuff. And I think it should be fine, but we don't necessarily, we have a little bit of time over 11:15 if needed. Okay, so our first speaker is Emilie Lawrence, who is a PhD student at the UCL Institute of Education. She's under the supervision of Professor Jessica Ringrose and Dr. Caroline Pelletier, and she's exploring fourth wave feminism and the ways in which feminists utilize social media platforms to engage with and challenge misogyny and e-bile online. She's a Twitter fanatic and also a cat mom. So thanks, Emilie.
Okay, so 12 minutes, I'll be quite quick. So what I'm looking at is how feminists are using social media to engage with and challenge e-bile and misogyny. Now when I say e-bile and misogyny, sometimes people are like, well, what definition are you using of that? So I put some great examples down here that are quite awful to read. But these aren't even rare, that's what's so tragic about it. So this one over here was sent to my friend Abby. She used to be a feature writer at the Daily Mirror, and now she's not, for reasons. But it says, Abby, let me lick your fanny. It may be saggy, it may be baggy, but it will be proper moist. It's lovely. And then here, that's what you get, bitch. Why are girls so scared of rape? You should feel pride. And then this one here I thought was quite important because it's saying that dismissing violent misogyny as crazy is a neat way of saying that violent misogyny is an individual problem and not a cultural one. And that's something that just kept coming through in my reading, this idea that often people like to separate it out as if it's just a one-off or it's just one angry man hiding behind his laptop in his mum's house or something, rather than a collective problem of sexism. So the reason why I wanted to look at this is because I think that Twitter is really informative. It's a really important source of news. And then a quick example is I tweeted something about American Apparel, and it ended up being in like 12 different newspapers, this one tweet, like a picture of my face. And then I got like thousands and thousands of tweets of men being so angry that I dared to question why a woman bending over was a good advert for a skirt. And then my grandma saw me in the Daily Mail, and that was really embarrassing. And I had people calling me asking for a quote, and I was thinking, this is one tweet. Like, all I did was tweet. And then the Daily Mail used my tweet as a headline of a story. It was really nerve-wracking because I was like, what is this? How has this happened from one tweet? And there was so much abuse as a result of it. So it got me thinking that this isn't a safe place for women and feminists sometimes. Which is what I've said there is often positioned as the site of hostility and misogyny with trolls and MRAs. Does everyone know what MRAs are? Okay, good. So I'm coming at it from a fourth wave feminist perspective. And it's really contested. Like lots of people are saying, fourth wave doesn't exist, what you're talking about, we're still in the third wave. Whereas I really strongly believe that we're kind of seeing this new movement now. It's taking place, it's reactive, it's immediate. And I kind of think that with social media, online activism, digital feminism, all of that, I think it's too big and it's too different to what's gone before to be just lumped in with third wave. So I'm kind of looking at it with that lens on. Yeah, this is lots of pointing. When I was typing this up, it didn't seem that heavy on literature. So this is just some of my kind of underpinning theory. So it's the idea that feminists are utilising social media, so they're creating these like valuable support networks, and that feminists are kind of taking to social media to carve out these safe spaces in these unsafe spaces, which I think is something really interesting, something really beautiful as well, that they're creating, carving out these like safe communities. And then obviously drawing on post-feminism, this idea that is feminism redundant, do we need it? And I'm kind of arguing, well, actually there's been a real real big emergence of like teen feminists, and feminism's kind of becoming the new thing with popular feminism taking place. So I'm looking at my basic theory and framework is that cyber mediums are a platform for discourse and change, that they're this big, big platform that we need to be taking notice of. We can't keep writing it off as this separate kind of entity where people just download consciousness. I'm saying no, it's people are always plugged in now. We're never plugged out as it is. Like, we're always part of it. And with iPads and iPhones and all of this, people are always on. And I'm really interested in what that means in terms of impact on society. And then I'll be arguing with post-feminist sensibilities. So this is kind of like my first question, is how do girls and women represent themselves as feminists and forge a community? And this is something I'm really passionate about. Like I said, I'm really big on Twitter. Like, I love it. I think Twitter is absolutely incredible. And a lot of my feminism has come from the support and like love that I've got from Twitter. So this is some of the ways that I found that women and girls are doing it. So it's work that's done in part on Twitter, which I think really sums it up. This idea that it's not just, Twitter isn't just this like vacuum that exists somewhere far away. It's making real progress, and I think that's amazing. And then these are kind of examples of like memes and images that are often thrown around and retweeted thousands and thousands of times. And that's kind of part of this new communication that people are taking part in, which I think is very interesting. And then I love this. When people ask me why you aren't married, I'm married to the struggle. If I wasn't married, I'd definitely be married to the struggle. So then, how do girls and women negotiate their relationships with femininity and other women? So this is again something that I think is really important, is that within post-feminism and lots of arguments that you can read, it's always women against women. It's this women as competitive, women as, there seems to be that there's like tiny amount of like space exists for women to be talented or beautiful, and women compete for that. And I think that something that Twitter's opened up is this idea that that's not true anymore. Like, women can occupy all this space because there's an infinite amount of space online. And this quote here is by one of my friends, Jay, and it's like such a beautiful quote. Don't ever compliment me by insulting other women. That's not a compliment. It's a competition none of us agreed to. I think that kind of just really sums up what I think about Twitter feminism, really. And then, again, we've got some memes I think are pretty good. And here, society fears selfies. I think that's a lot to do with like disrupting like dominant beauty ideals, really. And then here, I used to criticize selfies until I understood the radical politics behind them. And it goes on to say, this tweet was like part of a thread, and it just went on to say how women aren't seen in mainstream media. They can make themselves seen. They can trouble these like ideas of beauty that we see all the time. And selfies are the only place I see women like me. Unlike whites, I don't have entire industries made in my image. And this is something that Twitter's doing. Like, Twitter's giving these people platforms. And I think it's really, like, almost arrogant to underestimate the potential and power of that. So my main thing is, how are girls and women challenging hostility and entitlement? And I'll be doing that through 3 case studies. So again, this is just some examples of things I've seen. So rape culture and patriarchal values are killing girls. Feminism is upsetting white boys on the internet. This is amazing. I follow you for astrophysics and occasionally unfollow for fashion and feminism. Would you consider having 2 accounts? Like, there's an entitlement in that. Like, I have to unfollow you every time you tweet about something as stupid as equal rights. Or, could you get a separate account? I think that's pretty good. So these are my 3 studies. And I've started looking at them now. So we've got funnyisms. How are feminists using humour to like disrupt and resist the dominant representations of gender? So how are women kind of criticising and exposing the kind of bizarre value systems that have been regarded as normal? Then I'm looking at solidarity through feminist hashtags and social media spaces as sites for discussion. And then I'm looking, lastly, at taking the online offline and plugging out. So using examples of how women transcend the virtual boundaries of space. So how are they activists on Twitter and then offline? So for example, the protein world protests, slut walk, these things where women are tweeting and they're drawing attention to these like big issues, and then they're transcending those boundaries, so they're taking them offline. So yeah, So that's what I'm doing. These are my 3 studies. I kind of put a bit of detail in each of them. So to research all of them, so with feminism, I'm looking at websites and looking at dick pic critique. Has anyone heard of that? It's amazing how in like a professional way you can say words like dick pic critique. So dick pic critique is a site. One of my friends, Maddie, she hosts. It's massive. I'm sure some of you have seen it. You're just too embarrassed to say. You've like looked at it online. But it's where men send in pictures of their dicks and she critiques it. But rather than critiquing it like, oh, that's beautiful, she like does it in like a humorous way almost. Like, oh, the lighting's lovely. Or that's a great curtain in the background. And it kind of like diffuses the kind of like threat of it. Because the reason she started is because women were being sent these unsolicited dick pics all the time, as if it was somehow, you know, look at my dick, it's magic. And she really wanted to trouble that and be like, well, why do men think it's okay to do that? Why is there less fear in a man sending a nude? Like, a woman sending a nude, that's it, end of her life. You know, she's a slut, all of these awful double standards that exist. So she wanted to, like, draw attention to that and teach men how to send a good one. So I'm looking at that site, I'm looking at Misandry Mermaid, which is kind of like memes about misandry, so which is quite funny, it's quite good. And that's where I got the mermaid one from, this one here. It's a really good one. It's just playing on the notion that like, men are constantly telling women, I'm sorry to the men in here by the way, it's very like, but like, it's constantly playing on this idea that women are emotional, hysterical, highly strung, all these things that men like throw at women to kind of like undermine and invalidate their right to feel. And Misandry Mermaid kind of plays on that, and it says it takes the idea of male ego and kind of troubles it in like a humorous way. Well, I think it's funny, but some people might be like, it's weird. And women don't know you shit, for example, is quite a big meme. So I'll be looking at those sites, and then fucking Ethan Bros. Anyone heard of that one? Just swearing at you now. It's a website where pictures are taken of men who take up like 3 seats on the tube. It's like, you know, look how amazing my balls are, I need 3 seats type thing. So I'm looking at those 3 sites, doing content analysis and interviewing the hosts, because they're all really lovely. Then solidarity, I'll just be looking at hashtag analysis of hashtags like you okay sis, feminists are ugly, to kind of look at the way in which women come together, support each other, solidarity. And then like I said, it'll be looking at Protein World and Slut Walk and how they're planned, discussed, kind of created, constructed online, and how that's then taken offline. But yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Thank you.
And then I had a picture of Beyonce, but it's
Great, thanks, very interesting. Maybe we should do, before Gina, we have someone via Skype that's actually Skyping in from California. And I've just realized that maybe should we get them going now? Maybe because it's 2 a.m. there. Yeah. And I just realized that maybe she wants to go to bed. So if you don't mind, Gina, just holding off, thank you.
No.
keep her up, no, it's fine.
I was just like, I just realized we're running late and it's probably, she's...
Can you hear us now?
Yes,
Oh, we can hear you, that's perfect.
I don't think you can't see us, can you?
I can't see you guys.
Would you like to?
Yes.
There's a camera. This sort of seems darker though.
We don't.
You can see the silhouette.
If you'd like to share your screen, we can go ahead.
Yes. Let me do that. Thank you. Okay. So,
So I'll just introduce her before.
Yeah. If you want to put yourself on it.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to hear from Stefania Marghitu. Sorry, I never asked her how to pronounce her name. Marghitu. Can you hear me, Stefania?
me too good.
Sorry if I butchered your name.
No, that's great.
Stefania is presenting to us from California. She's a PhD student at the University of Southern California School of Cinematic Arts, Division of Critical Studies. Her primary research interests deal with critical and cultural studies of television, the showrunner and modes of authorship, feminist TV criticism, and production studies. You can find her work published in The Spectator, Gender Forum, Flow TV, In Media Res, and the edited collections Refocus on Amy Heckerling with Edinburgh University Press, which is coming out in 2016. And Smart Chicks on Screen, representing women's intellect in film and television. Her paper is called From Promotion to Politics, Mapping Shonda Rhimes' Twitter Presence. So thank you for doing this, Stefania.
Thank you guys so much for working with me on getting this to work.
I'm afraid the PowerPoint isn't working by sharing the screen.
Okay.
So we're going to go to plan 2, which is I'm going to have this PowerPoint on behind you, and you're going to be talking on the small screen. Is that okay?
Okay, how should we move them from slide to slide?
You just said next. Do you like?
Okay, thanks.
Sounds good, okay.
Okay.
Awesome.
We're ready whenever you are. It's fine.
Okay, great. And we can just go to the first slide after the title one.
Okay. There you are.
Thank you. So in its 2014 New York Times review of the ABC series How to Get Away with Murder, can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, it's great.
Okay, great. Alexandra Stanley infamously buried the lead and maybe her reputation by opening her piece with the statement, "When Shonda Rhimes writes her autobiography, it should be called How to Get Away with Being an Angry Black Woman." The article went on to presumably praise the creator, head writer, and showrunner of the ABC series Grey's Anatomy, Private Practice, and Scandal for her reputed stereotype-defying black female characters, from Grey's Miranda Bailey to Scandal's Sylvia Pope to Murder's Annalise Keating. Rhimes is in fact the executive producer, not creator, of How to Get Away with Murder, while her production company Shondaland is behind the series. Former Grey's and Scandal staff writer Peter Nowak is the actual creator of the Davis-led series that shares an ABC Thursday primetime slot with its fellow Shondaland production company's lineup. All 3 series are now found on ABC's Shondaland-centered blog programming called #Thank God It's Thursday, TGIT. Now Stanley's piece, and most notably that infamous lead, caused a notorious media backlash and subsequent question of her integrity, in which the journalist chose to focus on a TV creator's nuanced representations of black women by reducing Rhimes herself to a racialized gendered stereotype, and how her own black female characters function as these stereotypes as well, all while writing a review of a TV series Rhimes did not even author to begin with. Many of Rhimes' friends, fans, peers, co-workers, cast and crews of her series, and journalists all rushed to her defense on social media and in numerous think pieces, calling Stanley's piece unequivocally racist. Slide?
There you are.
Additionally, for one of the first times in her own career, Rhimes commented on her own identity and exuded an unprecedented yet merited indignation. And she first took to social media platform Twitter to publicly express this reaction. In a Hollywood Reporter cover story a month after Stanley's piece, the showrunner said, slide?
Yep.
In this world in which we all feel we're so full of gender equality and we're a post-racial society and Obama is president, it's a very good reminder to see the casual racial bias and odd misogyny from a woman written in a paper that we all think of being as so liberal. Slide. But Rhimes is not always vocal about addressing issues surrounding race and gender, on-screen or off-screen. In fact, in the same profile piece, she explicitly stated, quote, "I find race and gender to be terribly important. They're terribly important to who I am. Further, but there's something about the need for everybody else to spend time talking about it that pisses me off." She also cited that when reviewing a speech that honored her by calling her the most powerful black female showrunner in Hollywood, she removed black and female, noting that a white male showrunner would not be identified by his race or gender. Now this kind of identity politics is a defining component of Rhimes' public persona, demanding to not be defined by her race or gender, but speaking up against clear prejudices that reduce her and others to these qualifiers. The showrunner's early interviews, when she first began with Grey's Anatomy in 2005, those early interviews exuded a self-proclaimed post-feminist, post-racial mentality. Yet this visibly shifted alongside a greater awareness in America's own recent consciousness surrounding issues surrounding race and gender, increased by stories around Black unarmed youth killed by white police officers, as well as what Sarah Benet Weiser has called a new era of popular feminism. Rhymes as a user on Twitter, especially what is known as Black Twitter, a virtual community, serves as an outlet that I will focus functions as a grassroots platform compared to mainstream network TV. And this provides more freedom to express their views on race and gender and other issues much more freely than a showrunner under the restrictions of solely network TV. Twitter as a whole has functioned from a lighthearted mode of communication to a tool for social justice and politics, and for showing marginalized views. It is further indicative of Twitter's influence, in which these marginalized progressive views on current events are becoming more available to mainstream audiences as well. Now, the 20-page version of this paper argues that while Rhymes initially used Twitter as a self-promotional tool to encourage viewers to watch Scandal in real time, she later utilized the social media platform as a means to convey her resistance politics, her feminist views, her commentary on the institutionalized prejudice surrounding inequality in the entertainment industry, and her opinions surrounding the shootings of unarmed Black teenage youth across the country in America, from Trayvon Martin to Michael Brown, and then Twitter again in this case functioned as that grassroots mode of communication. Her views on Twitter are also reflected through other paratexts, from profile pieces to speeches. And so I refer to paratext taken from Jonathan Gray's media-specific definition, taken from its literary origins, as all of the additional accompanying texts besides the primary body of work for Rhymes, her actual TV series. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I have this in the wrong order. One minute for a second. Okay. But in the time I do have for this presentation, for the rest of it, I want at this conference around gender and politics of media producers, I'd like to focus on Rhymes' surrounding views around feminism. Again, in her early interviews, she adheres to this kind of neoliberal individualist rhetoric that may have been recently forgotten. In a piece by Kristen Warner on the racial logic of Grey's Anatomy's use of blind casting, she quotes Rhymes' again, self-proclaimed post-feminist, post-race attitude from a 2006 interview. Slide with the quote.
Yep.
She says, "I don't think anybody is colorblind in this world. Do you know what I mean? I think I'm a product of being a post-feminist, post-civil rights baby, born in an era after that happened, where race isn't the only thing being discussed. And I just felt like there's something interesting about having a show in which your characters could just be your characters." But unlike many other post-feminist programs of the late 1990s and early 2000s, though, the heroines of Grey's, Meredith and Christina, never retreated to the domestic sphere. These protagonists were driven career women who did not dream of marriage or motherhood, conveying an almost second-wave feminist mentality over a third-wave or post-feminist understanding. With her colorblind casting and representation of women, racial minorities and women were not deterred by any kind of institutional prejudices. As Elena Levine writes on the series, slide.
Yep.
The world Grace presents is in many ways one that has been changed by feminism, but instead of suffering from these changes or using such changes as a means of revalidating conventional expectations of gender, sexuality, and also race, Grace provides a feminist-friendly fiction, or fantasy, allowing us to imagine a world in which identity-based discrimination has been defeated to women's benefits rather than their expense. In a 2013 interview with NPR's Renee Montaigne, Rhymes confessed that Grey's was not an easy show to get network executives to fathom. Slide.
Yep.
I was sort of brought into this room, Rhymes says, I was sort of brought into this room And a bunch of older guys told me that nobody was going to watch a show about a woman who had casual sex and threw a guy out the night before her first day of work. And that was completely unrealistic, and that nobody wanted to know that woman. And I remember sort of sitting in that meeting and thinking, wow, they don't know anything that's going on in the world right now, or have seen Sex in the City, my side note. And that kind of conversation, I think, would never happen now. Now, from an industrial standpoint, Rhimes first needed to fight this battle over representing female agency and sexuality on network TV, which was a tough thing to do in 2005, alongside this kind of professional determination that I mentioned earlier. While she used blind casting and graves, she stated she wanted the protagonist of her next ABC series Scandal, Olivia Pope, to be Black. She states, slide?
Yep.
Being an African-American woman felt to me like there were certain things about that job that would leave her as being the only Black person in the room a lot of the time. And there were ways in which she would be treated that I felt were very specific to the Black experience. We did an episode where she walks into a room and the client immediately assumes that Abby, who's sort of the tall, white redhead she works with, is Olivia Pope. Simply because she's a white woman in the room versus a Black woman in the room. And you know, that's a thing that's happened to me, and there were things about it that I thought were very interesting. So after working in this predominantly white male network TV space, I believe Rhimes began to see the institutional prejudice that could be held towards a Black woman showrunner. In the same interview, she hints that the out-of-touch, befuddled white male politicians of Scandal's Washington, D.C. setting are not unlike the TV executives she also encountered. Within the past year, Rhimes has turned into a vocal feminist, again mirroring what Sarah Binney-Weiser has called popular feminism, and has become this proponent of social justice, almost a decade after these self-proclaimed post-feminist attitudes she conveyed. She often first takes to Twitter to convey her views. She has spoken about feminism at the Global Women's Rights Awards, along with fellow showrunner of Weeds and Orange is the New Black, Jenji Cohen, while a fiercely critical blog like Jezebel writes posts like, "The 10 Awesomest Things About Shonda Rhimes." She's won numerous Women in Entertainment, Women in Media awards, and is herself quick to retweet a BuzzFeed listicle based on her series on feminism and empowerment. What Scandal became the first network TV drama to star a Black woman as the lead since the 1970s, a really astounding fact. The show opened itself up to a Black female audience that had been waiting to see themselves as leads on screen. And unlike other Black female-led series before or during the same time as Scandal on BET or online or on niche-targeted outlets, these are again considered niche around their margins because they adhere to only Black audiences. But Scandal also opened itself to this broader audience on ABC through network TV audiences, just like series such as Empire, Blackish, and James the Virgin did this past fall. The recent success of these series further show how Rhimes' work in Grey's and Scandal stood out starkly compared to its counterparts, these white-centered network lineups that were so prevalent for so long. Although, as Kristen Warner's pieces proved, blind casting she uses was a dangerous tool and can still be a dangerous tool that often erases the complexities of race and its historical connections. She writes that the networks at the time loved Grey's because it was successful and it showed race without showing difference. While Scandal still only lightly touches on issues surrounding race, with a few exceptions and a strong exception of a recent March 2015 episode called The Lawn Chair, there are instances and situations in the life of protagonist Olivia Pope that suggest her constant double consciousness, thinking about being the only Black person, the only Black woman in the room, as Rhimes stated, that you can read very powerfully throughout this series. The Pew Research Center study confirms that Black women are the most likely demographic to use Twitter, and this can partially explain the success of Scandal on Twitter at first. After a season full of low ratings and potential cancellation on the horizon, Rhimes took to Twitter to encourage fans to watch the series and live tweet along. A cult of Olivia Pope soon followed, in which sales for slide?
Yep.
Oversized Crate and Barrel wine glasses she often coveted quadrupled, and slide?
Yep.
And the limited Scandal collection was released. And Scandal itself began atop the first Nielsen Twitter TV ratings, while cruising strong through the desired 18 to 49 network TV demographic. Yet, of course, there are much higher stakes to consider than the ratings and consumerism and fandom based on consumerism surrounding Scandal. Although this was initially a savvy brand marketing tool on the part of Rhimes' cast and crew, that was at the time pretty unprecedented, whereas now you see a lot of showrunners and actors and cast and crews live tweeting along to gain that momentum and popularity. Scandal itself also became more about gender politics within its political landscape, showing the struggles of Pope, First Lady Melanie Grant, and numerous other female politicians. It addresses these double standards pervasive throughout these white male-dominated industries. Using Rhimes' paratext, we can take much more out of the primetime viewings of Scandal. Taking again from the feminist fantasy Levine described in Grace, in this past season of Scandal, a Republican U.S. president and administration ensured gender equal pay, employed a woman vice president, while the First Lady ran for office in Virginia. Olivia Pope herself self-identified as a feminist, which has become, again, a popular current throughout mainstream media, to identify as a feminist. And while Rhimes' peers and contemporaries, from Lena Dunham to Mindy Kaling to Jill Soloway of Transparent, all are adhering to feminist identities and ideologies within their own series, Rhimes in 2005 planted the kernel for this in a time when talking about feminism or exuding a feminist identity was not as well received as it is now. We can also see this shift in the showrunner like Tina Fey from 30 Rock and her stance on feminism, from her own interviews and representations in 30 Rock to Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt on Netflix now. Although as critics have noted, her representations of race can still remain problematic. Now, Rhimes still, like many women and many minorities within a competitive field, often face the dilemma of not wanting to be defined by their race, their ethnicity, their gender, and they want to be treated as equals and to not be reduced to those identities and their potential stereotypes. At the same time, we are also seeing in the Hollywood film circle the most powerful actresses around, from Meryl Streep to Patricia Arquette, are making claims about the misogynistic nature of the industry and are attempting to make changes for women. Rhimes is still working within this very rigid system of network television in America, of which she is gaining more and more power and carrying an entire successful Thursday night lineup. Rhimes has certainly come a long way since her early days as the great showrunners in terms of talking about her ideologies, in which she did not want to discuss her race or gender at all at first, or her choices surrounding race and gender in her on-screen representations. And I think I'm probably low on time, so last slide.
Yep.
I'd like to close out with this quote from Rhimes upon winning the Sherry Lansing Leadership Award in 2014. This moment right here, me standing up here all brown with my boots and my Thursday night of network TV full of women of color, competitive women, strong women, women who own their bodies and whose love lives revolve around their work instead of their men, women who are big dogs. That could only be happening right now. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. It was a great paper.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. Are we going to be able to bring any Q&A?
Yeah, I can just leave it on.
Okay. So we'll leave you, I don't know if you're tired, if you want to go to bed, but we can also leave you up for the Q&A after.
Yeah, I'll power through. I'd love to.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so the next speaker is Gina Marchetti. Am I pronouncing that right? Marchetti. Okay. Apologies, I never asked you in advance.
No problem.
So Gina is coming from the University of Hong Kong. She's the author of Romance and the Yellow Peril, Race, Sex, and Discursive Strategies in Hollywood Fiction, Andrew Lau and Alan Mack's Infernal Affairs, the trilogy, From Tiananmen to Times Square, Transnational China and the Chinese Diaspora on Global Screens, and the Chinese Diaspora on American Screens, Race, Sex, and Cinema. Her paper that she's going to be presenting today is called Women Occupy Hong Kong Screens, Feminism, Media Activism, and the Umbrella Movement.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. I would set my timer here so that I know when to shut up.
I'll give you a 3-minute warning.
Okay, cool. Okay. I'm going to assume some familiarity with the umbrella movement. Is that okay?
Can you give a brief description, maybe?
Yeah, I will.
Okay.
I will along the way. Well, anyway, it's calling for a more open procedure for vetting candidates. As you might have seen in the news just today, there are folks in jail right now for supposedly planting a bomb near the Legislative Council in protest of this. So this is kind of an ongoing agitation for more open procedures for electing the chief executive, which should happen in 2017. In any case, most folks don't think this particular movement has a feminist agenda. However, when you look at the initial research that several of my colleagues have done at the University of Hong Kong, you realize that indeed over 50% of the people who were involved in the movement or who were on the streets during Occupy Central, which was last fall, 2014, most of those folks were women, or at least a small majority were women. And a lot of their activities surrounding the movement, from decorating the public women's bathrooms to doing agitprop artworks to operating democracy study halls, were conducted and led by women. Indeed, too, women suffered more than their fair share from sexual harassment by counter-demonstrators during the movement, and there are lots of instances of this kind of activity going on actually targeting the women. Now, when you look at Hong Kong's process of decolonization, which provides an important case study for the depiction of collective action on a global stage, you look at feminism and suffrage. When I'm thinking of that, I think of the trailer now for the suffragette movie that's coming out. I don't know how many folks have seen that. But in any case, it seems like suffrage has now become an issue linked to women again, and I feel that very strongly in Hong Kong. Now, of course, suffrage has been a hot topic for longer than the umbrella movement, and I'm not going to go into the history of that now. But I want to suffice it to say that suffrage is also something that has been on and off the agenda for feminists globally for quite a while. And if you look at Hong Kong's Occupy Central movement in relationship to other democracy movements around the world, particularly in Beijing in '89, like the Tiananmen Square uprisings and suppression of that, you realize that indeed women have been part of this process and very oftentimes agitating for women's issues along with suffrage. This, of course, just because I enjoyed history, I just wanted to give you just a little brief taste of suffrage as a women's issue. Once again, when people think of, I don't know if any of you are interested in Chinese women's feminism, but if you are, you'll probably know that suffrage, once again, is one of those issues that's on and off the agenda for women's rights movements in China, throughout the Chinese-speaking world, not only in the mainland, but in Taiwan and Hong Kong. Since the turn of the century, really, I mean the last century, not this one. So if you look at it, it's a very long-standing issue. There's also, I wanted to point out, continuing problems involving not just Hong Kong women, but also with women across the border. That part of the reason why a lot of women are involved in the movement is that they see that it's very difficult to agitate for women's issues in the People's Republic of China. So, and just to give you a brief current example of this, I'm sure you've seen them in the news, the 5 jailed feminists, the central government in Beijing, didn't jail them, but detained them, which is essentially like house arrest, detained them on Women's Day, this year. I don't know what possessed them, in any case. Now, in Hong Kong, there have been women on both sides of the political divide for a long time. Some of you who follow, or I don't know if any of you follow Hong Kong politics, but you might know Elsie Du, who is a woman who came with her husband, a missionary essentially, with the colonial government, and who became very much involved in suffrage issues. Now, she has subsequently, she's still alive, she's over 100. She has subsequently become a supporter, a very strong supporter of Beijing. So people don't like to talk about her that much anymore, but suffice to say, she's been a strong voice for both feminist and suffrage issues, and is a very interesting example of, once again, this post-colonial process going on. Okay. There have been lots of initiatives in Hong Kong involving suffrage, so just to give you that. And there are female politicians on both sides of the divide. So the top row, we've got some of the pro-Beijing, and then we've got the anti-Beijing folks, if you recognize them. In any case, the link between suffrage and feminism in the territory has been, once again, going on for a long time. And since the handover has really continued to escalate in terms of discourse. I just want to give you an example just of Eliza Lee's work on this particular topic, which is not the subject of my paper. Now, getting to the subject of my paper with all that background in mind. I wanted to look at, what I'm going to be looking at today is specifically the Occupy movement of last fall. And what I'm going to be looking at are women media makers who were documenting and making interventions within the movement. So I'm going to be looking at some of the folks who've begun to work on this kind of material. Some of the things I've already mentioned are evidences of, as Miranda Soto, who's my colleague, talked about, this kind of possession of public space. So it's both a possession of public space in terms of material culture, which I'm not going to talk about very much, but also in terms of media culture. So women are out on the streets. In this case, this is the public bathroom during Occupy, which Miranda has called the princess's boudoir, in which women occupy that physical space in a very particular way. So I'm also going to be talking about the very particular way in which they use media to occupy those spaces. A lot of this has come as a surprise to folks inside of Hong Kong as well as outside of Hong Kong. People do not look to Hong Kong young women and girls as activists, although they have been very strong in various aspects of the movement even before Occupy. Okay. There's been, of course, if any of you, I don't know if they televised, did they televise the student debate in the UK at all? I don't know, did you guys get any kind of news on this at all? It was a pretty amazing thing. Yeah, it's interesting. There was a debate between 4 students. One was a woman from Hong Kong U, Yvonne Liang, and they were on television as part of this debate with the government over suffrage and whether they should accept or not accept the conditions that were laid down. In any case, there were a lot of women demonstrators who were, agitating for their rights, not only to be heard in a public forum like television, but also be able to occupy the streets without harassment. Once again, another young demonstrator, Agnes Chow, of scholarism, which was a movement against national education in the territory, had to drop out. She said, I'm under too much pressure. And the young men in the movement, Joshua Wong, who I'm sure you've seen on Time Magazine, did not drop out. So the young women have been dropping out in a way that the young men have not, although they still maintain a certain numbers. There's also been women on the internet who've been working on documenting the movement. What I'm going to talk about today comes from an ongoing project that I'm involved in on Hong Kong women filmmakers. I invite you to go to the website. There is 2 pages on the website devoted just to the umbrella movement, and many of the short videos that I'm going to talk about today are linked on that site. Okay, so I highly recommend that. Okay. Glacier Wong is one of the women that you'll find on the site, and she is essentially a video blogger, and she talks directly to the camera about the movement, and the blogs that she does are quite short, little vignettes, very much first person, a lot about the harassment of female protesters as well as the use of tear gas. Okay. She addresses the camera too, and I highly recommend it. I think one of the things that's striking to me about the umbrella movement is how much of it is addressed because Hong Kong is so small and is in this kind of post-colonial situation, sandwiched between British and Chinese sovereignty. her addresses to the world. She speaks in English, and she talks about, and I'll just quote her very briefly, universal suffrage may not be so common as a topic in your country, which is a democratic state, but it is not common in Hong Kong at all. So she addresses the world as the world is someplace where a certain kind of politics takes place that are not taking place in Hong Kong. So I think it's very, very interesting. She is on the website, so you can see her there. Under the umbrella is a short video piece in which a teacher, as you know, you might not know, most of the movement, or a lot of the young women in the movement, as I've just mentioned, are university students in Hong Kong. Shannon Walsh is a teacher at City University of Hong Kong, and she did this brief video in which she profiles 3 of her students. None of them are, well, one is from Hong Kong, but she is of South Asian descent. The other is a Vietnamese student, and the other is from mainland China. And she contrasts their involvement in the movement and how they are both attracted to the movement and have their own feelings of being alienated by the movement. Here are some other examples that I just wanted to point out to you. Many of them are by students. Vicky Doe is one of the women that Walsh profiles in her video. So this is a student film. Nora Lam is one of my students who's done Midnight in Hong Kong. This is a still from her video. And the Umbrella Movement itself is was a commissioned piece, actually, for the Hong Kong U journalism students. Did that as a commissioned piece for MSNBC. Okay. Now, the one that I would like to highlight particularly today is a tiny handheld camera, which is more of an experimental piece by a woman, Liu Tao, who was educated in Beijing at the National Film Academy in Beijing. Kay Taka, yeah, I got it here too. 2 minutes. I will wrap up.
3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay, thank you. I will wrap up. It's a piece I highly recommend that you see. I believe it's not up on the site yet, but I will put it up soon. She is doing some final editing on it. The interesting thing about this piece is that she went to the demonstrations in Mongkok that were a bit rougher than the ones in Central and in Causeway Bay, and took a small handheld camera, which is the title of the video. And during the course of her interaction with a police officer, which was not a very friendly police officer, she was interrogated by him and asked, "What are you doing?" And she said, "I am making a documentary." Now, when she went down with her camera, she wasn't making a documentary. She was just, hanging around looking at the demonstrations and kind of taking some images for her own use. But at that moment, when she's confronted by police authority, she realizes that indeed she is making a documentary, that she is documenting the movement, and that she has become part of something that, up to that point, she hadn't seen herself as part of. It's a very interesting kind of immediacy to her the way she captures that particular moment and captures the reaction of folks around on the street to the confrontation with the police, and I highly recommend it. Now, I don't have time to go through the one documentary that deals the most with women in the movement. It's called Do You Hear the Women Sing? It was commissioned by a Christian women's group in Hong Kong. And there's a variety of women, most of them involved in various churches. Now, if you aren't that familiar with the movement, you may or may not know that a lot of the church groups are involved with the movement because of the fear if there isn't universal suffrage, there will be a curtailment of religious freedoms as well as women's rights freedoms as well as LGBTQ freedoms. So a lot of these videos reflect different positions within the movement, and this is one of them. So if you know about the beginnings of the movement, it was begun, before the student-led portion of the movement took over, it was begun by these 3 guys. Betty Tai, of course, is my colleague at Hong Kong U. And they set the tone for the movement before the students said, well, look, this is really, yeah, I know, I should wrap up. this is really our movement. Now, the women in the movement, and what comes out in this particular video, probably more strongly than any of the others except for Glacier and Kwong's, is the fact of sexual harassment. The fact that sexual harassment is used, police step out of the way and allow counter-demonstrators to harass women specifically in a sexualized manner, and that Amnesty International has come out to condemn this kind of tactic that is really allowed by the police. As a way of intimidating women who want to assemble and exercise their right to call for change. The video also features, as I mentioned before, Yvonne Leung again, the woman who was on television as the sole female voice in that television debate I mentioned. Now, what I found striking, and for me at least a bit disturbing, is her reluctance to talk about suffrage in terms of women's issues and feminism, which are clearly also on the agenda. And her reluctance to talk about it, but also her recognition that as a young woman, she has a very different kind of attitude. Now, I don't think that this kind of interview would be caught necessarily or be of interest necessarily to teams headed by men. These were all today, the teams that I've talked about today were all female-headed news teams or documentary teams that were working specifically, some of them, as this particular documentary did, on women, and some of them on men as well. Now, just to wrap up, I think that one of the issues that really is facing the Hong Kong Occupy movement today involves looking at women's issues as a human rights issues, as part of this Declaration of Human Rights. So that when you look at the lack of vocabulary, the lack of ability to talk about women in relationship to issues such as suffrage, rights, social change, etc., that this is a troubling gap in the public discourse in Hong Kong's democratic development. Now, the little videos that I've talked about today demonstrate indeed sexism exists, and that it is linked to and is a problem for women involved in any kind of political change. And as the interview I just pointed out with Yvonne Leung seems to suggest, the fact that women in Hong Kong are now visible across the political spectrum as activists and elected members of the legislature means that the fight for gender equality has been won. It does not mean that. Unfortunately, the visible record, as seen in these short films by women, proves otherwise. And if not verbalized, the urgent need for a specifically feminist critique of Hong Kong democracy seems to be unclear at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Adrienne Massanari. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Her recent book, Participatory Culture, Community, and Play, Learning from Reddit, examines the culture and community of Reddit.com. And that's what she's going to be talking about today in a paper called Feminist Resistance on Reddit.com, Shit Reddit Says, and Gamer Ghazi.
Okay. Hi. Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to try to keep it to 10 minutes so we can get out of here, which is hard because this is such an interesting topic to me. This is the book. If you'd like to know more, it's published by Peter Lang. It's out right now. I'm happy to talk to you about it. It's based on 3 years of ethnographic research on the website Reddit. How many of you are familiar with Reddit? People? Okay. So good. I don't need to really go into it. Basically, create a community of interest. People call this subreddit. People up and downvote content, and there's a bunch of default communities that you're subscribed to when you actually create an account on the site. And here are some statistics and all that jazz. And if you'd like to know more about Reddit, read my book. In general, Reddit's habitus, way of being, and discourse reflects the sort of the demographics of the website. If you look here, this was a Pew research survey on Reddit users. So it's probably, if you think of the average Redditor, they're going to probably be a straight, cisgendered, white dude in probably 18 to 24 range, college educated. So if you spend time on Reddit, that's not true about all of Reddit, but that's just sort of the general demographic you might see in probably the most default and most subscribed to subreddits. There's also, Reddit is a very strong sort of hub for geek culture. So lots of subreddits about technology, about gaming, about fandom communities, that kind of stuff is also there. Just in general, thinking about Reddit, we can think about it in a couple of different ways. We can think about it as carnival or carnivalesque from Bakhtin. We can think about it as some sort of performance from Schechner and Turner's work. We can also think about it as a kind of play, and of course, community and all these other things we can talk about too. One of the things that's very apparent on Reddit is that this carnivalesque spirit, as with many other websites that might revel in it, for example, Fortune, kind of rules to some degree. And that can be troubling and difficult to kind of know where the carnival ends and begins, especially when you're thinking about Reddit as a space for women. Reddit has a pretty troubling, I'm going to use Reddit as a collective here, not to suggest all Redditors, so not all men, not all Redditors, but Reddit has a very particular sort of male gaze that is usually projected onto women. So we can think about Laura Mulvey's kind of concept of the male gaze. The site often devolves into pretty problematic discourse around women and people of color, and people of different abilities and all kinds of things. So pretty much, I can talk more about this later if you'd like to know, but I can tell you all about it. But it definitely represents the sort of habitus of geek masculinity. And I don't want to suggest, again, not all geeks, but there is something about, if we've seen recently, a fair amount of this kind of vitriol, misogyny, latent and overt misogyny in, for example, hashtag movements, in that hashtag movement that shall not be named, because we don't want a bunch of people coming in to say hello to us. But there's also, the men's rights movement, which also has a very prominent sort of space on Reddit, and the red pill. And I would go into these more, but trust my word, you don't really need to go that deep into them. They're pretty, I would say, fairly terrible spaces, especially as a feminist, which I am, for spending much time in. The interesting thing is Reddit also creates a space for more latent kind of expressions of sort of misogyny. So we have things like these, which are just memes that were posted to advice animals, which was a default subreddit until fairly recently. And we can sort of see here in the different kind of guises, we have women as being sort of sexually available in a certain way, as being, or sort of overly promiscuous, or willing to not friend zone you, which is a terrible term. But there's sort of a very particular kind of envisioning of womanhood and of what it means to be a woman. There's also a whole series of memes that are about sort of anti-feminist memes that parents sometimes show up on advice animals, which are also terrible. So anyway, so why spend any time on Reddit if I kind of loathe it so much? There's actually lots about this place that I really like, and I actually spent, and I've spent years studying it. So one of the things that I think is very interesting is thinking about how feminists are sort of actively using using the platform for feminist activism. I'm going to be talking more about the other stuff of that, sort of why does Reddit get into all these terrible spaces at my Consoling Passions talk on Saturday. So if you're interested and available, please come and you'll hear lots more about that. So Gamergazi is a subreddit that is dedicated to dealing with the hashtag movement that shall not be named. It's Gamergate. Please don't tweet this. We don't want a bunch of people coming here. But so there's a subreddit called Kotaku in Action, which has been sort of the focal point of a lot of Gamergate activism for many reasons, and I don't want to go into a lot of detail there. But if you aren't if you're not aware of what Gamergate is, it's a hashtag activism movement about ethics in games journalism that has essentially snowballed itself into a way to harass women and people of color and their allies. That's not saying that all the people, not all Gamergaters, I feel like this is going to be my caveat, not all Gamergaters, but some people are using that as a platform. So Gamergazi is this sort of feminist response to Kotaku in Action. If you notice here, there's some interesting things, like one of the things that they did for their cascading style sheet, I'm interested in design too, is they actually removed the downvote arrow. And in some ways that's suggesting this sort of positive community atmosphere instead of, which is very different than much of Reddit. You'll also notice here too, you can see, you can't really read it, but they're playing on a lot of the same, the sort of ways in which they've been portrayed by gamergaters. So for example, they're called gazelles. They're destroying video games. And there's SJWs, so social justice warriors, right there now. And then there's a couple of other things here that are playing on DARPA, DIGRA, it's a long story there, the connection between those two. And then someone says that they're an avid Candy Crush player, which is another sort of theme within the Gamergate movement about casual gamers, that they're not really gamers. So Gamergazi is one way of thinking about activism, a very fairly straightforward way of thinking about activism. We can also think about it in terms of Shit Reddit Says, which is a whole, actually, slew of communities called the Fempire. This is Shit Reddit Says. So Shit Reddit Says is what's called a circle jerk, which I will get into in a second. This is a weird way to be like academic stuff. Yeah, so not all gamergaters, but yeah. So there's a circle jerk. The whole idea is that they highlight problematic discourse and speech on Reddit as a whole. So if you think about, there's another subreddit called Circle Jerk, which talks about sort of plays with the idea of Redditors as being fedora-wearing neckbeards in their terminology. And so SRS does that, but in more explicit political terms. What happens is that in Shit Reddit Says, if you post something, one of the things you do is they've inverted the upvote and the downvote arrows. And this is a lot, again, to do with the acquisition of karma points, which is partly the website. Each account has a certain amount of karma that's supposed to say how much their contributions are valued by the community. And Shit Reddit Says does things like they've inverted that. They've done things like in their space, this SRS Prime, they kind of talk as if they are actually misandrous, or they talk as if they reinvert the sort of politics, the habitus, the language of the rest of Reddit. There's, of course, because of this, there's a huge conspiracy theory about how Reddit administrators are all actually SRS people and whatever. It gets kind of crazy. It's kind of all over the place. So they're usually portrayed as downvote brigaders that will go into other subreddits and talk shit about the rest of Reddit. But what I think is interesting, so there's lots of posts like this. It's the most downvoted post ever, which is the essential sense that the SRS people are assholes and they just come to Reddit to complain about everything, or bitch, as they say, about how the rest of Reddit kind of conducts itself. What I think is very particularly interesting, and this is not new information, but when we see sort of this becomes an insider and outsider critique, right? So William Shatner can come on, he's actually Redditor, can come onto Reddit and make some claim about how terrible the community can be and how interesting it can be, but how terrible it can be. He's kind of met with a very interesting sort of conversation happens, right? So, which is not surprising. He's this white man, also a geek icon who can come into this space, but he's projected as, oh, you're right, William Shatner, we should really think about how we conduct ourselves. That's it's kind of like we do all this stuff, it's kind of like grotesque, it's kind of like a carnival, but yeah, so that makes the really good stuff look really good. Well, okay, so yeah, but so that becomes really interesting to me in thinking about who we position as insiders and outsiders. So SRS is continually positioned as not real Redditors. Feminists within Gamergazi are not real Redditors. They're on the platform, but they are contested, right? And so that is kind of an interesting negotiation that I see happening. I also think it's important to think about this as a kind of counter-performance. So if we think of Jeffrey Alexander's idea, they're playing with the same kinds of things that the rest of Reddit plays with. They're playing with cascading style sheets. They're playing with the ways of being the habitus, the kind of the lingua franca of sexism and homophobia, and turning it around. They have very, very, very strong content policies, and they will ban you for no reason at all, as the rest of Reddit would say. And that's very counter to Reddit's sort of the overall idea of Reddit as free speech place. I also think it's interesting if we think about this from Schechter's work, thinking about rules. The rules of SRS are different. They're there to, so rules, he says, are, quote, designed not only to tell the players how to play, but to defend the activity against encroachment from the outside. So part of what SRS is saying is like, you don't like our rules? Too bad. Go to the rest of Reddit where you're like totally welcome, because that's where you can play. But we are still Redditors, and there's sort of, and my interviews, which I could go into, but I don't have time, suggested that as much. That these are people who are on Reddit. They are avid Redditors. They spend a lot of time in places not only SRS but elsewhere. And as the same is true with Gamergazi folks, they live in that space. And so, but there's always a contestation. And because we're out of time.
3 more minutes.
Hey, you know what? I'm just going to let it early because I know we probably need time for questions and answers. So you can ask me anything. I can go on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we are running a little behind schedule. We have a brief 5 minutes, my apologies, for question and answer. But we will have plenty of time to talk to panelists at lunch and then later at the pub tonight. So can I get the panelists to maybe just come up, and we will take the next kind of 5 to 7 minutes, and then we're going to be starting the next panel at 11:45. So we have a little bit of wiggle room, and we'll get back on track. Apparently the Northern Line, there's severe delays. I just got via text, so we can say that's why we're running a bit behind. Blame it on the tube. So is there any questions? Start with Connie.
Thank you to all the panel for a really interesting range of discussions. My question is for Adrian.
Sure.
There's been a lot of, I guess there's a lot of talk in sort of popular and mainstream media about anonymity on the internet and what that does. So what would your stance be in terms of fostering sort of, I guess, sort of safe spaces on platforms like Reddit? Because there is also a lot of argument that anonymity is actually quite friendly for lots of people, not just geeky guys. Yeah.
I think that's a great question. It's one that I struggle with a lot. So Reddit is a pseudo-anonymous platform, right? So you have multiple accounts. You can create very interesting, people create novelty accounts because of that. And I think a lot of what enables other things to happen on Reddit and sort of a candor is partly enabled by the fact that it's not sort of a one-name policy, sort of a la Facebook or Google+. So I'm actually kind of in favor of some anonymity. I think it's really important. I think that there's lots of reasons why having us tied to a singular identity is a very sort of retrograde view of multiplicity as selves. That said, that comes with other things, right? I mean, just because someone is fully non-anonymous on Facebook doesn't mean that people don't post terrible things, right? So this sort of anonymity becomes this kind of this joker that we put in the deck and we say, haha, if we just took out the joker, it would be fine, we could all play this game together. I think it's actually really important to think about how you can create spaces that allow for play and engagement in multiple ways, and I think pseudo-anonymity might be one way of doing that, but still create a space that feels, you shouldn't be harassed and harangued, and Reddit's really problematic on both accounts, so I don't know if that's an answer to your question. It's kind of some both and. I have major problems with Facebook and Google for the sort of one name, one person policy. I think there's a lot of reasons why that's a very sort of retrograde view of anonymity or of identity. So hope that answers.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, my question is for Stefania. So if you can hear me.
I'm going to shout.
Okay, I'm going to shout out my question at you very rudely. So you talked about this kind of tension, especially in the beginning of sort of Scandal and Shonda Rhimes' career, between promotion and her identity in engaging with politics, like her feminist identity and engaging with politics. How did you kind of resolve that in your work? Because I'm dealing with a similar question in my PhD. So how would you, I mean, are you in a way kind of saying there's been a shift towards more radical action, or is it kind of something that is there and it's inevitable and it's something that you kind of looking at resolving?
So the tension between her as that post-feminist, post-race ideology and how that shifted?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. That's like my struggle too as well, because my research is on the individual showrunner and as an author and as somebody with agency, but also like working within this very rigid system and it's like a push-pull, right? Of agency and what you can say and what you can't say. But I think it is the easiest thing right now I can connect it to, or the most logical, is kind of this change in the past like 10 years, and since you started showrunning in a more like politically conscious showrunner, more politically conscious, socially conscious, like American, and how I think, part of the paper also deals with how Black Twitter and Black Lives Matter have like impacted, the individual Twitter user. So Twitter even itself, it's no longer like you, the individual, it's you as a part of a community. So that's a really interesting thing, I think, for me to think of in terms of how that's also impacted her, this powerful showrunner who wasn't really thinking about race and gender in that way, and how maybe this virtual community helped change her mind. But also it's such a politically eruptive moment in America right now. There's a time cover that's like 1968 crossed out, 2015, what has changed, what has not. So a lot, it's also the moment for me. I hope that helps answers a little.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So we have time for one more really quick question, if anyone has one more question. And if not, we'll just wrap up and we can chat informally throughout the day. So thank you very much for coming. We'll have about 10 minutes before our next panel, so if you're presenting, move on out, and there's still some coffee and juice and water you can grab. Thank you.